Could you tell us where you live and how you got there?
I live in Bucharest, Romania. I've lived here for over 2 decades now. I arrived in 2000, and at that point, I'd been traveling a lot, doing a lot of different jobs. I didn't have any career you could talk about, and the only thing that really mattered to me at that point was putting myself in an environment where I'd be able to concentrate on writing. I'd published one short story at that point, so it wasn't exactly a sane thing to do, but to me, it made perfect sense. I knew that's what I had to do with my life. So I bought a very cheap apartment in a not very fashionable area of Bucharest, and I wrote my first book there. And I haven't left since because I'm perfectly happy here, and in this place I have the freedom to practice my profession.
A lot of the stories deal with solitude. I mean, the story form allows you just to have a single character and to have a single thing occurring to him in that urban space, which sometimes you don't name, but the configuration makes it clear that you're talking about Bucharest. Yeah. And your vision of Bucharest is quite particular. You know, it's not, let's say, the most glamorous of cities, and you don't. The glamour doesn't interest you as much as the down at heel, the building that's half destroyed, what the Soviets left before they left. That all of that space is your terrain.
From the very first, the city itself appealed to me to the same degree that it repelled me, in that it was the ugliness of the city was. It's all there at the surface, you know. I arrived. Actually, the first time I arrived, I came in the 90s, and you could see that it was a city that had suffered a lot, and even a large part of it had been demolished under the communist years. It was a very harsh urban environment, visually too. It's very striking in that sense, and to have a city like that, to be able to describe it as a gift in a way, it's immediately appealing to be able to describe failure visually, because what you're looking at isn't it in a city that's failed is the failure of the society itself. And I remember thinking, even at that time, you know, going back a couple of decades, that what interested me wasn't success, because I was coming away from Ireland, a country that at that time was getting very excited about its own economic success. I was actually always more interested in failure. Not even talking about cities now. At the personal level, I think failure is far more revelatory of character and the human situation. Success is something that's necessarily temporary. You're not really going to see what a human being is until things start going wrong.
And were you nourished by your reading of Central European writers, and figures who were not particularly concerned with success, but were concerned with misery and with the sort of poetics of misery, and with solitude, and with being alone in a city, and not owning much except streets?
Not Eastern European writers at that point, no. Probably more the American ones. I remember being very impressed by Bukowski at a certain point. I mean, that's Los Angeles, but could you tell
us Bukowski? Could you?
Sorry?
More detail about Bukowski.
Yeah, well, that was autofictional writer, Charles Bukowski, who basically wrote about being an alcoholic and growing up in the Depression years. And finally, in his 50s, he started to get a little bit of renown for his writing, but most of the time he was just doing dead-end jobs. And I love I suppose it's more of a punk aesthetic in writing, and that it's consciously anti-literary and maybe very vulgar and describing very mundane things. Total lack of pretension in the writing, but at the same time very funny too. At the same time, very skilled writing. He's a very skilled writer in terms of managing to compress narrative, and I was very interested in the seamlessness between his poetry and his prose. That there was essentially no difference. He was just looking for the most the most reduced way to actually narrate a series of events. You know, it took a lot from Hemingway too, though he might not like to admit it.
Your sentences don't deal in flourish. You don't show off. You don't describe things in great or glittering detail. You tend to have a very direct, sometimes quite a sour style that is very clean and cleared and chiseled, and it's very satisfying. And there isn't a wrong note in it. You know, the stories are really beautifully made. And I wonder if part of the reason why that happens is you confine your characters to maybe a man and his friend, maybe a man and his daughter, or maybe a man alone, and that with that single character, with that amount of fierce concentration on this single thing, you can find a style that works for you.
There's two things. One is I'm always I think of writing as a way of achieving a kind of focus and clarity that's missing in our daily lives. And I don't like going to writers who make me swim through extraneous detail. And I generally don't like novels. I always think that the job of the writer is to cut things back. I mean, there's some writers that I really admire, like Saul Bellow, who don't fit that description in terms of the prose style. But Bellow, for example, has this tremendous fluency and verbal richness and energy, but he's still obsessed with this idea of focus and trying to find the calm center from which the world can be observed. I just don't have that kind of. I don't write hundreds of pages. I can't work like that. And it's my curse as a writer, because I'm always cutting. I'm always looking how to make something briefer and more powerful. I mean, right now I'm trying to get away from writing short stories. I'm trying to write something longer, and I'm having to retrain myself. I'm having to give myself some on-job training in not getting bogged down in a particular page and paragraph. I give myself a time limit to actually write a block so that I can come back to it and then behave in my usual obsessive manner. Because there's an element of obsessiveness to it also, this kind of behavior. I just managed to focus my obsessiveness on a socially acceptable form of behavior.
I mean, if I was to connect you to anyone Irish, and it wouldn't really be worth it in the end, that there is a connection to someone like John McGahern, who went back to the same terrain over and over in book after book. That, you know, the same tree was in the same place, the same house, same shadows, and the same sort of lane up to the house, and also the same grumpy way of responding to other people. And that
you're not helping me sell any books here.
Look, these stories are great. Anyone who doesn't read them is an idiot. So I mean, let's sell away. But I'm talking about that sort of way of not being afraid to find the same apartments in Bucharest, the same systems, the same, for example, stuff about dogs, stuff about daughters, stuff about leaking buildings, that you go back and back to them in a way which is actually very satisfying for the reader, because you're in a recognizable terrain that you are circling and circling in a way that a novel might do by just going on and on in the same terrain. You just find another version of it and go back to it.
Yeah, it a lot of it is just very day-to-day things. I don't know how much writers choose their material. I don't know how much you lose yourself in trying to be ambitious and go far beyond what you really. I was going to say no. I think it's what you really feel. You have to write about the things that you actually feel and see. I remember when I came to Bucharest first, when I was trying to write my first book, I had the idea that I was going to write, but I had no idea what I was going to write or what I was going to write about. And the problem solved itself immediately, because I was living in a 10-story apartment block on the edge of Bucharest with a lot of day-to-day problems and a lot of very frustrated people. It was the poor part of a very poor city, and just in terms of the visual environment, I could speak Romanian at that point, but it was still strange to me in that it was easy for me to identify events and things around me that felt to me like they were, for lack of a better word, material. They just felt interesting to me as day-to-day happenings. And I ended up just, wasn't even a case of accumulating material as much as just trying to limit the way reality was pressing in on me. That's what it felt like, because it was just felt like day-to-day things were pressing in on me, and I was just trying to sort them a little so that I had a little mental space, and these things actually became the book, the first book. Just very, very banal day-to-day things. There's even a long story there where I just describe a day in my apartment block, and they're mostly true things. I was just, how do I find the detail that's most expressive? That was the question.
There are times when you're dealing very directly with now, that the story is set in a given moment, and we don't get to know much about you. For example, you don't, suddenly say, would go skip 2 paragraphs and start giving us your Irish childhood. You the character of you, the protagonist at the center of the stories, is almost stateless. He's an outsider. He may be Irish, but there are much more important things to say, such as there's a dead dog that needs to be removed. There's something leaking upstairs. And these are more pressing matters than the whole question of where you come from, what your pluperfect, he had been, he had gone, he had come. But there are a few stories in which the past really comes in, and it's not your past, it's the European past. For example, in the story Spring, you talk about bathroom, bedrooms, living room, kitchen, me and her, and a cat living our pastel lives. And then you go on. I scan the old deeds, yellow parchment, a transaction, 1941. Koppel, German name, no, Jewish. That was the Jewish quarter, March 8th, week after the pogrom. A mob, shops ransacked, basement tortured, chambers, corpses hanging from meat hooks. Immediately I'm filling in the blanks. Someone with sense, Jewish, emigrating, selling cheap to a young couple, their friends, Betty and Nathan. I read on, Betty and Nathan's set up, and you continue, who else was there? But you have that sense that Bucharest is a city that once had a large Jewish population and now doesn't. And those ghosts interest you. They don't interest you all the time, but they're there and they matter.
Yeah, in the same way that I was describing how everyday things in the urban environment, I just feel them coming at me. And the past is the same. It's not something I have to go look for. I do live in what was the old Jewish neighborhood of Bucharest. I live in streets where a pogrom swept through in 1941. I live in an area where the Jews have left. I live in an apartment where Jewish people used to live. And the thing about the deeds, it was just something that's autobiographical. It's something that happened when I was buying the apartment. I discovered that it had been bought and sold by somebody Jewish, had sold it to someone else Jewish a few weeks after the pogrom in 1941. So I immediately started to think, what happened? What happened in this building? Did somebody with some money leave to go to the United States or Israel? Did they give the apartment to somebody they knew? And then they left in the 1950s, and they probably have children in Israel or Buenos Aires. I don't know. So these things about the Jewish past, they do interest me, but again, I don't want to be like that like that kid in the, what's it called, The Sixth Sense, and he goes, I see dead people, but I always have when I'm walking around the city, I always feel as if I'm reading the past. It's in the fabric of the place.
And I think you're very careful where you make glancing references to Ceausescu and his building mania and just the amount of concrete he sought to put down. But you don't want to go there. You don't want to go back into the dictatorship, because the post-dictatorship, aftermath interests you more than the thing itself.
Well, I refer to Ceausescu as the pharaoh at certain points, because he that's what interests me. You have this megalomaniac, this old man who's trying to deal with his anxieties by building the biggest building in Europe, and that's what's left to us is one person's madness. They're able to give it shape in concrete, and he's gone. But we walk through it. We walk through it every day.
You're not afraid in the stories to be very grumpy and sour. The sort of lone male figure just is, it's not as though things easily cheer him up. And, it's really enjoyable to read things like the sort of Proustian Madeline for you is the smell of warm shit and cheap disinfectant. It was like a Proustian fairy tale, and then just suddenly easy to say, I don't like dogs and I don't like people who like dogs. But actually dogs loom rather large in the stories. But this whole sense of the character as, he's just not going to give in easily to easy happiness. There's one moment where he says he doesn't like the word feelings. And I'm saying we're talking
about a lot of different characters here. And maybe maybe one of the reasons I don't talk about my childhood in the stories, as you correctly said, is I'm sometimes autobiographical, but I don't want to be overly identified with any of these characters. They represent me to varying degrees. But fair what you say, I don't think I'm ever going to join the diplomatic corps. I don't think it would work very well.
The reason I'm raising this business of being grumpy is that the stories then start to push away from that, and that you have very surprising images that are really almost transcendental, absolutely ready to accept happiness, especially the scenes with the daughter. But also, just to take, for example, the last paragraph of My Life in the Movies. Our kitchen is small but filled with the last of the evening light. I sit down opposite her, and I wonder why I seem to observe these scenes from outside unsure what will happen next, and pretending I feel no confusion. She smiles at me lovingly, as though I am a three-dimensional man. I feel vaguely ashamed in her presence. I mean, there's a tough truth in that, the whole sense of feeling that he isn't fully there, but nonetheless, it's as near as it's going to get to a moment of happiness. And those moments of happiness start to matter in these stories. I know that's not a question, but I suppose I'm asking you if very deliberately you realized that business of the lone male figure in the rundown European city, walking the streets, slightly homeless in a number of different ways, that you can sustain that for a certain length, and then you must do something with it. It's not a question.
Yeah. I don't think it's enough to be grumpy. And I like grumpy writers too. I like Celine. He's the most wonderful grumpy writer, and I mentioned Bukowski. If a writer is going to be grumpy, I think he should be benefit from a certain amount of humor and self-awareness too. I don't know. I read Knausgaard lately too. He's very grumpy, but he's not very funny. He's not very funny, that guy. And
but he's good. Knausgaard, is the guy who wrote My Struggle in a number of volumes.
Yeah,
and he's good with kids, though. He's sweet about children.
The second book, yes, absolutely,
yeah.
And no, the man has magnificent recall. I'm very jealous of his ability to reconstitute entire conversations. And when he builds a scene, he'll go into this extraordinary amount of detail, and you read it quite quickly. I recently thought it resembled more than anything reality TV. He's the Proust of the reality TV age, where you're basically, what you're being treated to is a spectacle. No matter how ridiculous, or at sometimes the man is ridiculous, or even there's whole stretches where it's actually quite boring. You feel as if you're watching something that's real, It's like watching a very dragged out reality TV show, but you just can't pick up the remote and turn it off. You're going to watch it until the end.
So in your book Trouble, the figure that comes to sort of I suppose to make the stories just to vary the stories and give you something new to deal with, which is the daughter, which is the child, which is this image of the father looking after the child. And the whole sense of looking after is important here, because he is genuinely, and he begins to watch her world but with great sort of sympathy. There's a scene where they're on a little walk together, and there's a lovely moment where she was 2 years old and she had to hang from his hand, taking each step of the big steps. And in a way, that's old-fashioned short story writing, where you're just getting a little detail that's exact. You can actually see how this might happen. The 2-year-old going down the stairs, and then they're walking, and you go. Their journeys were always strewn with leaves, sticks, stones, and flowers to be investigated and collected. She drew his gaze down into the detail and texture and color of small things. They would discover a colony of ants and stoop to follow the line where it ascended a tree trunk or crossed a footpath and disappeared into a crack in the concrete. She registered birds and dogs and cats and an entire universe of living things that he would otherwise be deaf and blind to. And there's another wonderful moment where she's asleep and wakes, and it's clear she's hearing something, and he realizes it's a car, but it's 2 streets away, and it seems distant enough, but she wakes to hear it. And there's a whole sense of her sort of sensory perception becoming part of the father's life, just as much as his way of looking outwards at the city. That she, I'm not saying to you that she redeems the stories. It's not that, but she becomes a really interesting presence, because she certain moment, she brings in a sort of beauty and lightness and innocence into a world that isn't beautiful or light or innocent.
Yes, I am a father. I do have a child, and I remember saying to a certain Irish writer who likes to write about hallucinogenic drugs that the strongest drug I've ever experienced is being a parent. It does turn you upside down and inside out. And I probably realized that it was the drug I needed at one point in my life, because I was solitary and grumpy, as you observe. And the wonderful thing about children is it does complete you, in the sense that it reconnects you with the part of yourself that you start to lose as you become older, that many of us lose as we become older, and that we should never lose. And it's it's to observe how the way that children do see the world as though it's created new. They are seeing it for the first time, and when you're close to them, you see it that way too. So you're coming back to your own childhood. You're coming back to the source of joy that we all have to maintain if our life is to be worthwhile. And the infusion of just effortless humor that children have. You notice I'm not talking about the sleepless nights and all the other things that they steal from you and the energy they suck out of you. But at a certain level, children do complete you. And I don't know what my life would have been if I hadn't become a parent, but it's something I never regret.
And do you ever, and this is a really stupid question, do you ever feel, as you're getting the child, the child is awake during the night and you're not sleeping properly and all the things you have to do, do you ever feel, at least I'll get a story out of this, that actually this child has been so good, not only for my general well-being, my general life, but actually the fiction has changed, at least something has come out of this?
No, I didn't at the time. But since, yes, of course. And I've always kept a journal, which is a wonderful thing, because you actually, you remember a lot of things, but you forget a lot of things, and memory falsifies a lot of things too. And to be able to go back to what you read, to what you wrote sort of 10 or 20 years ago, is an extraordinary experience, because it just has a certain day-to-day texture that you'd lose otherwise. And I love going back and being surprised by some of the things I wrote. Like at the moment I am writing about when my kid was small and things like that. And it sometimes I'll just read something that I've forgotten and it just sparks and I can go for pages. It's very very cheap way to write a lot.
Yeah. You mean that an ordinary walk you would take and you would see a dog or see trees, or the child would say woof woof, or that is registered in a diary, and then you find, I can use that today. I know where that.
A lot of stuff I'm coming across in my diary. You see, when you write a diary, it's on one hand it's a horrible experience, because you realize how little you change as well, and how you make the same complaints over decades and decades and worry about the same stupid things. So there's a miserable part of it as well, reading a diary and going back to parts of your life where you weren't happy, or there was conflict. But other times you'll just get a sentence will jump out and you don't want to waste it, and it can be the key to something. The key that opens the door and gets you another page that you might never have written.
Do you feel in Ireland a sort of insularity, provinciality, that, something like the commemorations of 1916 were taken so important by the state, by people in the state, while you're in Bucharest, where many other things have happened? For example, a sort of strange native fascism grew. A sort of dictator of the most ridiculous sort, but also fierce, reigned. And no matter what you do, it's the trains to the camps are there in the background somewhere that you feel, I suppose, as Beckett might have felt, that you went somewhere real when the possibility of being somewhere unreal was offered to you on a plate?
And now with the war in Ukraine, and that seemed at one point a year ago as if it was coming very close. It's a neighboring country. I read the paper. I try and stay up and keep up with the news in Ireland as best I can. But I do feel very detached from what a lot of people would consider important political concerns in Ireland. It's things here have been so much worse, and for such a long time, between genocide and dictatorships of certain different colors, and now the war next door in Ukraine, and the fact that democracy is something that you cannot take for granted. And I go back to Ireland, and I mean, it's wonderful to be on a small island that has so much stability, really, and hasn't had the turmoils that this part of Europe has had. But I don't take any interest in what people would consider the pressing problems of the day, which seems to concern, like I'm sorry, I just don't get excited about climate change or gay marriage, and a lot of other things that people in Ireland would consider extremely important. They're secondary when you live in a country or near a country where democracy might not exist soon. In which case, everyone's rights are not going to matter. It's not going to be a matter of categories.
I was one of the perfect readers of First Love because I didn't read the end. I didn't read the explanation at the end in italics until I read the story.
All right.
I hesitate now because anyone will comment to the story. But I do want you to explain to us who Bruno Schulz was.
Bruno Schulz was a Polish short story writer who wrote in the 1930s. He lived in a town called Drohobych, which is now in western Ukraine. He was Jewish, and when the Germans came and took Drohobych in 1941, he ended up in the ghetto of the city. But he was a very talented visual artist, and he became basically the slave of the SS, I don't know what you'd call him, the SS man in Drohobych who was in charge of exploiting the labor in the ghetto. And he ended up doing paintings in this guy's house. Schulz, I think he died in 1942 or maybe 42 probably it was. He was shot. All the people in that ghetto ended up going to being sent to one of the extermination camps, gassed. But he's a magnificent short story writer. I think he wrote 2 volumes of short stories. And I ended up basing this story on the general who exploited Bruno Schulz. Schulz doesn't actually appear in First Love as a character. He does actually he's mentioned, but he's not by name.
But it's clear that there's a slave who can paint. And it can be used for various ways to cheer everybody up.
It's there for anyone who knows who Bruno Schulz is, who knows the connection.
Yeah. But what you're also dealing with, I suppose, are the ironies surrounding the sheer cruelty and viciousness of what's going on, because your SS man is he's really in love and he really wants his girlfriend to come and join him. And he's right, it's written in diary form. So you're sort of thinking, oh, well, it'd be good if his girlfriend came. And then he just mentions, the number of people he shot and they had to dig their own graves in the same tone, diary tone, which I think is taken from a diary, isn't it?
Yeah. I actually went and the diary's not published, though you can find bits of it online. But I went to a library and dug it out and sat and started reading it because I was researching Bruno Schulz for an essay I was writing at that time. And that is exactly what shocked me. I was ready for the violence, but I wasn't ready for the fact that this was a man who was mostly writing about his love life and how much he missed his girlfriend. If I did anything, it was actually to tone down that contrast because I was afraid that it wasn't going to seem credible the way it was actually in the diary.
There's a story in the book that's going to follow you around everywhere you go. And I'm sorry to tell you that because you've written an Irish story. And it's a story called Smoke. And if anyone thinks, Philip Ó Ceallaigh went off to Bucharest and he's been writing ever since about, the experience of the Romanians and, the sort of the deadened city. But anyway, no, he's actually come back. He's written a story called Smoke. There's a short story by John Updike called The Happiest I've Been. And I was just thinking about it. No one reads it, but it's just this guy who's going off to university and it's the last night and he's got a girl, he's got a party, and he's going to get away and he's going to go to some great university. And it's that night when he's at his most handsome, everything is ripe for him. And that's the happiest I've been. And I realized somehow something has happened since John Updike that none of us could write that story anymore. Readers would just get sick. Readers would just say, could you give me a break about the happiest you've been? And that, this, just tell us about this story, Smoke. I mean, I think it's a brilliant story. I think in any anthology of stories set in Ireland by Irish writers, this figure is big. I mean, it's really beautifully constructed. The general sense, even when the cops arrive, you feel, I know these cops, and even the language, like someone say, "Go on, you did," to somebody else. But also the background. If you could just tell us when it's set. It's set during a particular event in Ireland that people will remember.
Well, it's set during the period when the statues were dancing in Ireland. All the statues were moving. I can't remember what year that was, but I know I was a teenager. I was still at school.
I think was it probably 85 or 86? It was certainly one of those mid.
Yeah, that sounds right. Right. Ballinaspittle, and there was a few up the road from us in Waterford. There was one in Kilkenny, and there was one down the other end of the county. There were a number of them started dancing jigs. It was a real period of national hysteria. But yeah, I don't know how I got the idea to set it against that background, but it just seemed to. Oh yeah, it seemed to work because the main character, he falls off a motorbike, and for a moment he seems to have this almost out of body experience when he hits the ground, when he's coming to, that stays with him. And I thought it worked well with that, because his family is away looking at the statues, but he's completely alone for the day for that reason.
Yeah. It empties the house, which gives him an excuse for all sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in the Updike, of course, any sex that's going to happen will be really sweet and will be remembered as, a great, gift in a way. But I don't think that's possible anymore. If you're doing, teenage sex, there always has to be something else going on that
sounds
isn't
terrible.
What? Are
people not enjoying sex anymore?
Well, I think in your story, there's a whole sense in your story that it's not as exciting. I mean, there are other moments where you describe sex where it is gorgeous, and you actually say at one point, you sort of now get the point of what everyone else has been into all along. Like this is But I just mean that particular story, it will involve, of course, if there's a boy and a girl, something treacherous will happen. I mean, that the girl will leave him and he will be left desolate. That, you know, that shape.
Resemble life.
What I'm saying is that now
yes.
that shape of a story seems to satisfy us more than the one where they could just be happy and walk off into the bogland or into the empty house.
I know, just describing what usually does happen, though. I mean, most things aren't that stable. I'll tell you another thing about that story. At the end, he doesn't just have sex for the first time. He has his first cigarette. It's not immediately after he has sex, but it's after he escapes from the cops. And the only reason that is there is I was asked to write a story for an anthology in Romania called My First Smoke. So I had to have a cigarette in the story, and that was the way I resolved that problem.
I was talking about grumpiness, and I maybe went on too much about it, but I do love those buildings and the cleaning up of buildings and the finding somewhere to live and the constant searching for a haven and the sleeping on everyone else's floor and the refusal to do any form of nostalgia or sentimentality. We just don't have any of that. But when you then win your images, I mean, you win images of content, images of goodness, images of beauty, you know, that they're hard won in the sense that they're not obviously going to happen. And towards the end of the book, there's a particular word you use, which no one will associate with you, but it is, I mean, words such as good and words such as love. And so he says, this ordinary business of doing things, which these stories are very good at, just the ordinary business of doing things. He got out and dried himself. You know, I just have to say, I think that's a good sentence. He got out and dried himself. Immediately, he began to sweat again. The sun was not as high now. It was a good moment to mop the entire floor. The evaporation would cool the place a little in time for the kid coming home. Not that she ever complained, but it would be a good thing to do. I think I just think that's a great paragraph. You know, because you're not writing it all the time, you come up to it, you're surprised by it, and you're utterly convinced by it. And then as the story is ending, this is a story called Dead Dog. When the child was born and he first held her, he felt he was good enough to protect her and do only what was right. That was love, and nothing else held the foolish, precarious world together. And so I found that those particular passages in the book extremely moving, but not just that, but really convincing and hard won. And they're part of, I suppose, the glory of the book, which is that there is a basic way of watching the world warily, suspiciously, uneasily, of being easily alone, in a dingy room. And then out of that, you can get transcendence. You can get moments of pure happiness or pure possibility, or even from a sunset, but particularly from the child. And it makes the book extremely satisfying. And I have to say, I really love this book, and it's been absolutely great talking to you. And I'm sure everybody in the library has questions to ask you that are much better than the ones I've been trying to ask you.
Well,
so we should pass it over.
Thank you very much, Colm, for those words.
Really, really thank you very much, and thank you very much for this book.
Thank you for your interest.